Okay, I think we can kick off. Welcome everyone. This is the first of Local Wisdom, Global Insights, Fostering Cooperation in Conflict Research Beyond Borders talk series. I'm Efe Tokdemir. I'm an Associate Professor of International Relations at Bilkent University, and also I serve as the Director of Research at Center for Foreign Policy and Peace Research. Well, this workshop is sponsored by the Center for Foreign Policy and Peace Research and its journal, Azimuth, a journal of foreign policy and peace. Remember, both the center and the journal has long fostered scholarly dialogue between the center and the periphery, global north and global south, serving as a platform for scholars from global south to enrich the field of international relations and facilitate global dialogue with insights and perspectives from diverse regions. In line with this goal, today, our first guest speaker, Dr. Kathleen Gallagher Cunningham is with us. She's a professor at the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. Her primary research interests include self-determination, secession, civil war, leadership in rebellion, and nonviolent resistance. She received her PhD from the University of California, San Diego in 2007 and has been a Fulbright scholar, and now is a research professor at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. Her work has been published in very leading journals and the university presses like Oxford University Press, American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, international organizations, Journal of Politics, Journal of Peace Research, Journal of Conflict Research, and it goes on. She received the ISA's 2017 ISSS Emerging Scholar Award as well. Well, speaking about our topic and the data, let me also remind you that she has previously collected and published novel data sets like dataset on actor fragmentation, strategies of resistance data project, a global dataset on organizational behavior, the Forge dataset, which examines the roots of rebellion. So she is also pretty, experienced when it comes to data collection, data analysis, and I believe that her insights will be very loaded in that sense. For the newcomers, I would like to repeat two announcements. All participants are muted and their cameras are off to avoid any interruption, given that we have multiple participants. And to save time, we will ask dear participants to ask their questions via chat instead of every single time turning on their cameras or microphones and ask their questions in person. We will collect these questions using your name. We will direct these questions to Kathleen. So sorry for this long introduction, and without further ado, Kathleen, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for that really kind introduction, Effie. I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everybody for probably short presentation, although academics always say that. Effie, is that successful in sharing the screen there? Yes, looks good. Okay, great. So I'm really excited to join you for this conversation today. I'm going to start with some pre-prepared remarks, kind of walking us through what I see as the evolution of conflict research in terms of data and methodologies. And I really look forward also to the prepared questions and also to the audience questions. As Effie noted, I have spent, I guess, the last 20 plus years engaging in research, almost all of which involves the collection of original data, to the point where I nearly always finish a project and say I'm never collecting data again. But for me, the things that are most interesting are often the questions that we don't have great data on. So back again, collecting original data, and I look forward to talking to you about that process. Okay. Going too fast. Here we go. Just as a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today, I just organized this in a few themes per the requests that I got. I'll talk briefly about the types of conflict that we study or that the research community has been studying that I'm familiar with. And then get into some more details here about the differences in units of analysis and how we study these different conflict processes, specifically then the outcomes that we're focused on and the types of analysis that have been used. And then I'll talk about part that's really exciting for me, different sources of data, and then some thoughts on future innovations moving forward. So to start with this question of types of conflict, this is really expansive. I'm sure I'm missing some things here, but I wanted to just, for the audience, group these into what I see as sort of the relevant branches of the empirical study of conflict. And first, I would say you have these groupings between interstate wars. So we're talking about conflict, outbreak like between Ukraine and Russia. There's a great deal of work trying to understand when wars break out. And then there's a branch of work that came to the quantitative study of conflict subsequent to the interstate war studies, which are studies focused on civil war, or what we would consider armed conflict within states, typically bounded by a national border. And then there's also a set of works focused on intergroup violence. This comes more, in my estimation, from the comparative politics branch of political science. Has had a long history of work on intercommunal conflict, and we've seen some trending towards an empirical quantitative study of intergroup violence in conjunction, particularly with the study of civil wars. We've also seen a move, I think, in the last decade, 15 years, to a quantitative study of one-sided violence, or what's often called civilian targeting. And this is by lots of different actors in conflict settings, including the state, rebel groups, and militias. There's also a large body of work on terrorism as a specific type of violence. And then within that, a set of works on suicide attacks. So you can see, as we think about these different categories of conflict, you often have these nested studies within them that get more specific on individual tactics. And then what I have seen and hope to have had an impact on in the last 10 years is really an integration of the study of violence with other kinds of tactics. And this has always been a reality in terms of our understanding of conflict, and particularly very focused studies on individual conflict. But the quantitative scholarship on the use of violence, civil war, and one-sided violence has often ignored the idea that these actors can be also using other types of tactics. So we've seen increasingly work on rebel groups using things other than violence and how this is going to impact some of the outcomes of violence we care about. And then other actors that we wouldn't necessarily define as rebel groups, but that use both violence and nonviolence in different political situations. As we think through the study of these different types of conflict, we've also seen an evolution in how we study them in terms of the unit of analysis. And I'll walk a little bit through this here and note that these are huge bodies of work. And I won't necessarily hit on everything that's been done, but kind of lead you through what I think are the relevant shifts that have happened over time. So we can think about early qualitative and quantitative studies focusing on international systems theories of conflict, right? Thinking about when is a system more or less prone to conflict. And then a set of studies that took both a monadic approach to interstate war and then a dyadic approach to interstate war. So asking questions such as what kinds of countries are more prone to engage in conflicts, and then subsequent to that, what pairs of countries are more prone to getting into wars. And I think the democratic peace literature is probably most emblematic of these shifts from monadic to dyadic studies. As the field of study of the Civil War grew, we saw a few trends happening here. This really started as what you could call like a country level propensity for civil war. So the questions that were being asked were essentially which countries are likely to see a civil war, and then the answers were focused on the country as the unit of analysis. There was a growing recognition of the interdependence of countries and the broader strategic environment, which led us to studies of contagion across borders and trying to understand regional dynamics as they relate to civil conflict. And then from this, we saw a real shift in terms of disaggregating the levels and units of analysis. So moving from the country level of which countries are likely to be in war, the dyadic approach asks essentially, how can we understand conflict between pairs of actors, including states and rebel groups? Sort of following on this and related to it closely would be triadic approaches that then bring in other actors, whether those are foreign states that are supporting them or other international organizations. And then this led to an increased focus on different types of rebel groups as actors that have their own constitutions and can make sort of independent agency decisions. And this kind of study focused on things like whether or not rebel groups had certain types of recruitment practices or different kinds of features related to how they structured their leadership or engaged perhaps in conventional politics through political wings. And then finally, for the most recent trend that I have seen in terms of understanding differences in units of analysis and disaggregation would be a push towards using events data and geocoded data. So events data, such as the ACLED data project or the original SCAD data project, these are data sets that take individual events as their unit of analysis. So it could be a bombing, a protest, a battle, and then assign them to specific actors. But it's much more fine-grained than we would see in, for example, a dyadic level study. And then another trend that has opened up a lot of doors for different kinds of analysis are the geocoded data. So not just looking at specific actors and whether or not they're in conflict or how that conflict is being carried out, but where that's happening in a spatial sense to get a better sense of trajectories of conflict, as well as things like the impact of being close to the center of the state or being close to the borders of the state. Okay. So given that we have these different types of violence that we're interested in, different possible units of analysis, we can think about also the outcomes that we see in these different studies. And the sort of most basic or earliest studies of quantitative approaches to conflict really focused on these three first outcomes. Onset, right, is a conflict active, and when did it start? Duration, how long did the conflict last? And then termination, what was the nature of the end of the conflict? So we think about these three different outcomes, we can see a few differences in how they've been studied. In order to study onset, originally this was really focused on, particularly for Civil War studies, did the country have an onset? Unlike the international conflict studies where you have a set of actors that all could be at war at any potential time, within countries, we didn't necessarily have an identified set of possible rebel groups. There's been some movement forward on this in terms of identification of disputes over which civil wars are typically fought, and that allows us to get a better sense of the potential cases of wars that didn't start in addition to those that did start. The studies of termination is also one where you see a lot of richness. In terms of the quantitative study of conflict, we can see wars ending through victory. We see wars ending through negotiated settlement. And in the case of many civil conflicts, we see them end through lack of activity, right? That the war just peters out. So there's a great deal of work trying to understand the determinants of these different types of war end. And then there's some really interesting work on that and some of these next features here, like recurrence, to see if you end a war in any specific way, is it more likely to recur? The studies of civil war recurrence have also focused on a lot of other factors. Again, this is a sort of set of studies that take at its base that a war has already occurred, and then you're looking for recurrence after conflict ends. So you've got a really defined set of cases that you're focused on. And recurrence is unfortunately common, so there's a great deal of work going into trying to understand the correlates of recurrence. And then finally, one of the other outcomes, well, in this set that we're focused on often is intensity. This in quantitative studies of conflict is almost always captured as the number of battle deaths in a conflict. And I'll note here that there's some debate going on about studies of intensity, particularly with respect to how do we understand intensity through battle deaths over time when we have radical differences in access to healthcare and emergency care that might be changing not the level of violence, but our perception of the level of violence that's happening. A final set of outcomes that I'll talk briefly about are sort of less about the act of fighting and more about the sort of process and dynamics that are happening here. The first is contagion, which I noted earlier as something of interest. This started with studies that looked at the spread of conflict across borders, in part focusing on the idea that literally conflict moves across borders, either through refugees or through arms movement. There's also some very interesting work on contagion that relates to learning and how organizations and individuals learn from seeing conflict in other areas. There's been some really exciting work also focused on cooperation among conflict actors. So taking the premise that within a conflict system, it won't necessarily always be that all actors are in opposition to one another. So looking at alliances with rebel organizations, or even the flip-flopping of anti-government organizations to supporting the government and back again. A final note on the outcomes, again, this is not all of the outcomes that we're interested in, but one that I think might be of interest to this community is on forecasting. And forecasting is less about explaining individual instances of conflict or trends in conflict, and more about trying to understand what are the best models for predicting conflict into the future. So they take sort of a different approach to understanding what we can learn about conflict from these different kinds of models and data. So given that we have the types of conflict we're interested in, the units of analysis, and the outcomes, there are a number of different techniques that can be used, and I won't try to go into all of them here, but I will note a few that I think are common and becoming more common. So almost all of the early large N quantitative work started with regression analysis. Many of these are time series cross-sectional data, so they're looking at either countries over time or potential conflict dyads over time. Many of these are also duration analyses, so looking at how long different aspects of conflict have lasted. We've also seen an increase in network analysis focused on conflict. So this acknowledges a more complex relationship between actors in a conflict system and tries to understand the patterns of behavior in conflict through networks. Another area where we've seen a huge growth is in the use of surveys and survey experiments. These are used often to get more clearly at specific mechanisms underlying theories that we've been trying to test with observational data. So often you'll see these conducted in conflict areas or in post-conflict areas, trying to assess specifically how individuals are thinking and acting, and is that consistent with our underlying assumptions from our models of conflict? And a final technique I'll note, although this is not one that I am particularly familiar with, but I think it's quite interesting, are machine learning approaches, and I'll talk a little bit more about AI and machine learning in a few minutes, but these are more inductive approaches to understanding conflict. So instead of having a specific question and a theory and trying to find support or not for that argument, an inductive analysis through machine learning really lets the data drive the findings in ways that are somewhat different than we do in traditional regression. Okay. I'll talk for a few minutes about data sources, and then the last slide, which is next, will be about forward thinking. I've spent a lot of my career working on the creation of new data to try to answer questions and evaluate arguments that I'm making. And I've gotten that data in terms of the process through lots of different sources. One of the most commonly used ones for making data, particularly if you have a factor you think impacts your question, is to use publicly available news sources. So these can be from things like Factiva and Nexus Uni are common ones used in the United States as aggregated news sources. I've also seen studies that use things, just New York Times, just BBC, and essentially you are gathering data from these public news sources about whatever conflict dynamics or actor-specific characteristics you're looking for. Now, there are challenges for this kind of data. I'll chat briefly about them in a minute, but let me preview here that, as I'm sure everybody is thinking, the information that gets to be on the New York Times is not necessarily an accurate reflection of everything that's happening in an area, in a conflict or in a region. And so there are biases inherent in using publicly available news sources. We've also seen a growth in the use of social media data, particularly Twitter, to try to understand how people are feeling about different kinds of conflict dynamics or different actors, focused on sentiment analysis. I'm trying to understand how individuals are interfacing with different messaging related to conflict. These studies are often very interesting. There are challenges, again, to using this type of data. One of it is getting access to it. So these are often gated news sources if you want the amount of information that you need to run your study. And there are other sort of challenges, writ large with social media and how that reflects accurately or not individual preferences or community preferences. And then finally, I'm going to mention crowdsourced data as a potentially interesting source of information, again, with different kinds of caveats than something like news source information. So there are crowdsourced data sources such as crowd counting, which does nonviolent events. But we've also seen crowdsourced data coming out of real-time conflict areas like Ukraine. So providing information about different dynamics that are happening on the ground. And this is seen potentially as a way to gather data in order to test arguments. So let me just conclude here. And again, I really look forward to the further questions. Note a few things that I think are sort of on the frontier, or I want to be something that we're looking at moving forward. The first is the use of AI and data generation. And I have to say, as somebody who has made a lot of data, more or less by hand, by reading over and over and over again, different kinds of reports, by working with research assistants, this seems like a very exciting opportunity potentially. I'll note as you think about whether AI is going to play a role in your data generation, you can use this to assist with data coding. It doesn't replace human coders. And this type of instrument can be really effective if you're examining a corpus of documents, so news reports or policy reports, and determining whether or not they have the relevant information that you would like to get out of them. So the idea of having a machine reading these rather than an individual person is definitely appealing. However, this integration really relies on effectively training your machine learning model with a subset of human coded data. So it can't necessarily substitute in at the outset for human coders, but it could be used in conjunction with human coding if you can effectively train a model on this. The second piece that I have been thinking about for many years, this was inspired by some conversations with Lil Moore, who is a great conflict scholar. And one of the things that he always pushed me on in my own work was to think about the bias that was inherent in what I was doing just by creating data to answer questions. And so the idea here is that you could think about this bias that you know is occurring. For example, we see in a number of places, you know, the reports you get might be biased because reporters are not able or willing to report on certain kinds of conflict behavior or certain kinds of actors. You could have bias just based on what's appealing in terms of attention to news readerships. Another area that I think we're having increasing challenges in terms of data collection is that particularly in the US, and I think maybe in other places, you have less and less people in the field reporting and more centralized approaches to news generation, so that even though you're getting local news, the local news is a reflection of a more aggregated news source. And so I think you have this reduced granularity of data over time. So thinking creatively about how you would use modeling techniques potentially to address that within your data, right? Not giving up on collecting original data, but thinking really carefully about what you're able to produce through these different systems of data collection. One more area that I think we're seeing a growth in work on that I'm very excited about and just want to call some attention to is the growing field focused on civilian agency. Even as we moved from, particularly in Civil War studies, which is more my area, and we moved from looking at a country level study to a dyadic approach, which is really important to then thinking about, well, who are the other actors that might be involved? The actors that got sort of ignored for the longest were the civilians, and they do actually have pretty complex interactions with these violent actors on the ground that should shape the processes and outcomes that we're interested in. So there's a number of people working on this. I'll just name a few: Michael Rubin, Oliver Kaplan, and Cassie Dorf, all exciting projects focused on the civilian agency. And then let me say one final thing in thinking about what I would like to see moving forward. And this is, I think, a pitch I'll probably just keep making for the rest of my career. We have some really fabulous data projects in conflict studies. We have the Uppsala Conflict Data Project, Ethnic Power Relations. We have ACLED, Correlates of War, the Polity data set. Or in addition, I think a lot of the innovative questions and theories that we're coming up with, that scholars are working on today, require new forms of data, require different levels of analysis, and often focus on understudied dynamics of conflict, such that these off-the-shelf, large, institutionally supported data projects are not necessarily going to provide what we need to evaluate our questions systematically. So I think it's essential to support smaller data-driven projects. These can be smaller in the sense that they focus only on one or two conflict dynamics. They can be smaller in the sense they focus on small geographic areas or timeframes, but projects where we are seeing new and creative data and that it's really paired to high quality questions and answers to move the field forward. So let me stop there, and I look forward to the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen. This was a very nice, background about the conflict studies and the current, current situation in conflict studies, how these studies use data-driven research. So at this moment, actually, there are some questions we would like to direct you. Then we will start getting questions from the audience. Meanwhile, those who are listening us may start actually crafting their questions on the chat. Let me very begin with the first question, a very direct question, given the nature of the, this workshop. Well, there's a fact, and that fact is that large chunk of our data is not coming from United States or United Kingdom or similar contexts. Unfortunately, the conflicts occur mostly in, some call it global south, some others say periphery, or just local, whatever, whichever you would like to use. So what is the current landscape in conflict studies concerning the collection of primary data, engagement with local knowledge, and collaboration with global south, collaboration with local scholars? If our data is largely coming from this, then, I mean, what about the past and future of this, reality? And how can the global community amplify and recognize their contributions to foster a more inclusive and diverse field, according to you? I know that it's a very, difficult question to answer. And actually, it requires so much time to answer those questions, but I really wonder your insights about this.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I'm not going to push it off to the next session, which I know focuses on local knowledge and collaboration, or my colleagues that are in that one. I'll just going to give you my thoughts about this. I think this is a really important issue. One of the things that I guess I would say I have seen happening, at least among my colleagues, is a recognition that for these if you're going to do large N work, you need to pair this in some way with local knowledge. And this is a bit of what I would say with my call for smaller data projects, rather than always relying on big data projects. There are always a set of assumptions that go into these projects that drive the process through which they collect the data. And I think, as you've identified, often the people making those assumptions are in the global north, or in the west, or in Western Europe and the United States. So they have different priors about actors, what's important to them, what kinds of behaviors are really on the table in terms of action. So one thing I've seen happening, at least with some of my collaborators, is actually going into the field not to collect data, so to speak, but to do things like focus groups and to chat with people about how they think about this. So I have an ongoing project right now centered in Mozambique. And as I think about sort of how you create data, the first thing we did was to use available news sources in the language that people speak there. Right? So we started with sort of working through a corpus of documents that were in the language, looking for information there. The next step was to go into the field and do focus groups and actually find out how different people think about the issues that we're focused on. And preliminary finding, and Cyan Loyal is one of my co-PIs on this project, so you may get to hear about it in the next talk as well, is that there are differences in the way people perceive things compared to what our assumptions are. So I do think that there's something that can be done in terms of, as you think about creating data, if you can, right, maybe you can't always go into the field. If you can, making some sort of effort to have conversations with people who have more intimate knowledge of those contexts. And that could be something like doing an online workshop, it could be going into the field. In terms of the collaboration, I think this is also really essential. What I've seen in some context for granting agencies now is a requirement for collaboration with local scholars. And I think that that's a really important push towards diversifying the ways that we do research, and also creating these direct links between scholarship on the ground in places that are being studied and scholarship that's being generated really far from those areas. Yeah.
Thank you. And maybe, I can have a follow-up question regarding what you just said. Actually, you depicted the current, the current state of the literature in the sense that we try to pair up these, large and observational data with some kind of an, some kind of a case, or through in-depth interviews or focus groups, collecting data from the micro level as well. So we know that it was not the case once. I graduated back in 2017. so not a long time ago. And I can say that the mixed method research, yes, it was there, but it was not very common indeed. Or, I mean, I remember all these syllabi making the readings back in 2000s, 2005, 10. I mean, it was mostly like, how to say, I don't want to use armchair sociology term, but it was more like, I mean, large N data sets, not going to the field directly. I mean, crunching some numbers. So what happened and why do we need this pair up right now? What did we understand that something was missing so that we would like to do this next step?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. And so I will be holding this against you for the rest of our careers. We know each other. So I don't know. I think there are a few possible answers. So one is training, right? So are people being trained, overtrained in some aspects of research and undertrained in other parts? I do think this is for conflict scholars that are kind of leaning towards the international relations field as it's sort of defined in the US. My sense is that there is much more rigorous training in the methodologies for quantitative work using data than there are for qualitative approaches, in terms perhaps of understanding the value of those approaches in conjunction with this. So, in my own graduate program at University of Maryland, we have a class on qualitative research. I didn't personally take a class like that when I was being trained as a political scientist. I did get this really great, I will call it advice, from one of my mentors, who does do quantitative work, which was essentially the statement, if you can't tell me 3 times this phenomenon has happened with proper names, why should I believe you, right? Even if you found data and there's a correlation and you've got 72 stars and it's a really big effect, if you can't say that it ever happened anywhere, then this is not something that's particularly interesting to me. And that really stuck with me, right? It's more the sort of proof of concept idea that it's not enough to show significant correlations, even with sophisticated methodologies. If you don't have some handle on the actual political process that's going on that you're trying to emulate with your models. So that may be part of the sort of issue here. I think another driver potentially of that shift is the publication process. So one of the hardest papers I tried to get published had a formal model, an instrumental variable analysis, and casework, right? It's like I don't know how to get, I guess we could have done a survey experiment and been more mixed methods than that, but it was a mixed methods paper. And essentially we kept sending it out for review and there was always someone that really didn't like one of those methods. And so the publication process really pushes us towards single methods, I think. And then sort of related to that, for junior scholars, pressure to publish sooner has been very strong. And if you're going to want to go into the field or do more in-depth work, that's going to give you this qualitative expertise, that's not going to happen quickly. And so the downward pressures on publication, I think, and the nature of the review process are also driving that. We're seeing more and more of these studies that are, just one type of thing, right? Staying in a specific lane. And then I guess a final potential driver, I think, is the granting process. It's much easier to get a big grant to do a study that lets you go into the field and do focus groups when you're further along in your career, when you've already had success. So for junior people who I think are often coming up with some of the most creative questions and answers and really thinking about things differently, they often don't have the support to do that. And so that may be where this idea of the collaboration becomes even more important, right? So having collaborators rather than just trying to get funding to be in different places and ask different questions.
Okay, great. I mean, given that you are right now conducting a project in Mozambique too, as your field.
Yeah.
Of course, it must be, pretty straightforward for you, but given that there might be many graduate students listening to us or will listen to us, what is the added value of conducting a research there? I'm not only talking about Mozambique, but in general. Right now conducting your research there, can you tell us a bit more, what you would have missed otherwise? That's the first question. And a very brief follow-up based on this. Of course, you're not a citizen of Mozambique. Probably you don't know the language of the place, the local language. So how does it work, the collaboration process? Are you contacting with some, conflict scholars in some Mozambique universities or something else? Could you please also talk about this, practical sides and added benefits?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will speak a little bit about that, but I'll also talk about, particularly for the junior people, what I did when I was a junior person without any money or reputation. I did very targeted field work for my dissertation that has never, I think, played a role in any publication that I've ever done, but it was really essential for me. I spent time in Paris, just not it's not a difficult field to work in, although I will say every time I went there, something was being set on fire. So at least as a American where there's hadn't been a lot of overt protest behavior, that was a unique experience for me. And what I did on those kinds of projects and those trips and the value added to me was I was able to speak with former ministers in the government who actually enacted the policies I was interested in explaining. I met with academics who were focused on the part of my case that was there, which was the Corsican self-determination dispute. I met with journalists who were working on this issue, that they often have a much different perspective on the different actors and what they're doing and why. And the value added for me was a much deeper understanding of the political process that I ultimately wanted to understand and explain. That was sort of like mini field work on the fly, very targeted, but almost exactly the kinds of things that I think speak to this distinction between where you're sitting and who you're talking about, and can you actually get access to people in that respect. In terms of the current study that's happening in Mozambique, this is a study that's focused on climate change specifically. So part of the reason we're studying Mozambique is because of their experiences with iterative cyclones and flooding and the diversity of different hazards that are happening there. The reason that I think it's so essential to be there rather than to collect data there is one of the things that we're quite interested in is everyday people's perceptions of authority around climate hazard. And so, this same study could be carried out in other places. And if anybody wanted to give me a lot of money, if anybody on the audience has a lot of money, just get in touch. That would be great. But we've sort of picked a place that we think is going to give us a lot of variation on the things that we think matter. And we have an opportunity to try to go and understand at the individual level what's happening there. In terms of local contacts, the way the project has run so far, we had PIs go into the field initially. They're meeting with scholars, policymakers, research groups that work in country, and the work that we're doing is in collaboration with local partners. So we don't do anything without having local partners that we're working with.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. So I'm done with my questions, and for the next 15 to 20 minutes, let's say, I don't want to keep you for a long time, neither my audience. We have some really great questions on the chat. So let me direct those questions, and I would like to get some relatively brief answers if possible. So to begin with, Gizem Kaya from Bilkent IR, Gizem is a PhD candidate in our program. Regarding newspaper-based coded data, much research solely focuses on English news by overlooking news in the local population's language. Do you think that this situation impacts the accuracy of data?
Yes, that's a great question. And yes, it does. I think it does impact the accuracy of the data. What would be really interesting, somebody wants to do this, would be to create two parallel data sets of English sources and in local language sources to see what the difference is between them. I don't know of any work that has done that, but I think that would be really interesting. The other question that comes up, I think, is translation. So you have these English sources, some of which are just translated from other languages. And I can't speak whatsoever to the quality of the translation that's happening or what might be missed in the information. This is particularly an issue for my early work, I think, because I was interested in the identification of specific actors making specific claims. So often when I did get translated news sources, the names of actors would be slightly different. And this was really challenging because United People's Revolutionary Front and the Revolutionary, People's United Front, maybe they were the same organization, maybe they weren't. And so it entailed a lot of additional data collection on my part to try to really drill down and find out what kind of accurate information I was getting. But I do think it's a big concern.
Great. Well, there's one question I will ask it at last, but before that, İhsan, a PhD student at Rice University. Some of the small data projects do not get to be used as much due to everyone gathering their own data. While more data helps in studying new questions, it prevents building on the findings of others, except some major works. Given the value attached to data generation regardless, do you think this trend can somehow harm the discipline? I think this is a great question.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand this right. So the idea is that if you're using more of these small data projects, they're not, it's not easy to build on them or to have multiple studies that then incorporate different kinds of data. Okay.
As far as I understand, that's the question. And also, given that we can measure the same things in slightly different ways, maybe through small data projects, not knowing each other.
Yeah, I think I'm still a fan of, I guess my advice is still, this is much more for junior scholars. I do think there's value in the data generation. And I think that comes with time and more expansive projects throughout your career. My own interpretation of my success with new data is that the first project got published and recognized because of the question that I asked and the answer that I gave, and then my ability to thoroughly try to investigate it with that new data, but that the new data alone was not a huge contribution. And I think over time, I've been able to make it into a contribution and to expand upon it and to build out the projects. But I think the idea that you're, a sort of from 0 to 1 starting data project would be of use to many people is just not really viable. I think for the exact reasons that you've identified. And so I think the value then comes not from the new data, but from the argument that you're making and your ability to test something and the approach to a question that couldn't be asked without this specific data. Are people duplicating each other's efforts? This is probably like the specter of all graduate and PhD students, right? As someone else writing my dissertation, there are differences always across these data projects. I would recommend, joining the listservs for your professional organizations, trying to network the best you can, and not necessarily worrying other people have the same projects, but potentially, finding out and collaborating when possible. One example I know of this that I thought was really creative was some graduate students who pooled their whatever small monies they had gotten in graduate school to run surveys together in another country, right? So trying to combine resources where possible. And then, yeah, I mean, I agree. You're not necessarily going to be able to link in all of your data to other data sets. If you can, right, you can try to make connections to them where possible. And I've tried to do this in my own data projects is to, I collected very original data for my dissertation in my first book, and then I connected it to the UCDP and the EPR eventually, right? There's not perfect overlap, but it makes it accessible to people that want to use it.
Well, maybe I can also make a contribution to this discussion. I don't know what you think, Kathleen, but I believe that our field, especially our subfield, is coming to a state that we will need more meta-analysis papers. I can, for example, come up with many different papers specifically coding, for example, inter-rebel rivalries or inter-rebel alliances or actor fragmentation or rebel governance efforts. And I guess maybe in the upcoming 10, 20 years, we will see more, papers like psychology or economy do right now, engaging in meta-analysis, trying to understand whether the results were driven from the measurement biases or other things. It was not the case once. We are witnessing the baby steps of data collections and data analysis in the last 20 years, but probably next year's might witness that. My next question from Bedri Şahin from Germany. What do you think about the positive or negative effects of news published on social media? I'm not sure if I did very well understand the question, but if you understood it, Kathleen.
So, yeah, I think I could speak a little bit to this in terms of the research perspective. So using social media data. This isn't my area of expertise. I have read and seen some work on this. I think there are opportunities for, particularly, I think, as I mentioned earlier, understanding like crowd sentiment, crowd movement, these types of things for like inputs into our models, potentially for understanding violent conflict. I would say I'm personally a little bit skeptical, not of research based on social media, but on the sort of meta trends in the use of social media and how we can understand and predict those, given sort of what we see demographically, who uses what kinds of social media, when that's changing, as these companies change and they change their policies. There's a lot going into that that I think is maybe less understood than the biases we see in, the New York Times article publications or the AP or things like that. So that's where I would be more cautious about what I think we can say based on the news through social media.
Okay, thanks. Last two questions. So Mehmet Erdem Arslan from Turkey. I wonder your take on quantitative conflict studies in other disciplines such as economics. It seems to me they care more about the consequences of violence than the causes, and they sometimes put less emphasis on theory compared to political scientists. Do you think the existing dialogue and collaboration between the disciplines is enough, or it can improve?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think you're right that there are real differences in what they're trying to do in the approach. I would say I actually read less of the economics work right now, but I actually read a lot of geography related to work on deforestation. And I think it shares this with economics in the sense that the politics is often, if not completely missing, very under the radar or very simple. And so from a political science perspective, I think these approaches that are very sort of pattern and model driven, I don't know, I think there's a disconnect between our understanding of political processes and how we want that to feature in our work and the stuff that you would typically see in an economics journal. It's not exclusively true. There are things I think that are published in economics journals that are quite good and speak really well to political science. But I think you're dead on that the processes is not something that they're interested in by and large, and it's much more about the outcomes. They also have really different approaches to modeling, and this is something that I guess I'll just note really briefly. Like fixed effects models are the norm in economic studies, and I would say they're less so in conflict studies, in part because of the variation that we have, right? There's not always a lot of variation in the outcomes that we're interested in, and sometimes even in the inputs that we're putting into the models. And so if you're using a fixed effects model and you're really restricting where the action happens in terms of the variation that the model captures, that's sort of better suited to the kind of data you see in economics rather than in political science, and particularly in conflict studies.
Thank you very much. And our last question for today, well, it's a good concluding question from Deniz Özdemir, Bilkent University. Deniz is an IR student in our department. What directions do you see conflict research taking in terms of cooperation between global North and South? Do you believe that new technologies are enhancing or hindering the potential for cooperation? This is also a good question. Maybe I can make an addition to that. You, for example, said that you learned from, talking to all these people when you were doing your field. But another feature of being in global South or periphery, or again, whatever you would like to call it, limited resources. And this is not only for global South either. In many state universities in the United States as well, students can barely find funds to go and conduct research abroad and other places. Having this in mind as well, the role of technology, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that maybe a potential positive that's come out of the last 4 or 5 years is the degree to which people are willing to get on Zoom and have these conversations, to be able to have workshops where you have participants from different places. So I think in that sense, the technology in terms of collaboration has really improved so that you can be working with a team that does live in different countries and potentially has different access to different resources that can be utilized. Particularly for junior scholars, there's an increasing number of networks that are mostly based online that are engaging in different kinds of workshops, different kinds of events to try to connect people. I think this is a real benefit to that. That's part of the technology. I will say even at more institutional level, so organizations like the International Studies Association, I think are taking the international part increasingly seriously. That has been a move that I saw as a part of their long-range planning committee a few years ago, that this was definitely part of the conversation and something that could be, an effect for change here. But I still think that, without more ties, right, maybe between universities as a way potentially to do that, that it's really difficult for particularly junior people to make these connections and to try to, include these different kinds of research as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathleen. These were all great answers and a great presentation as well. And thank you very much to those who are in the audience for listening to us. We really believe that this is an important topic to keep discussing. The role of especially data collection, data analysis, and collaboration around these topics in our field. In the next upcoming talks, we will keep discussing these matters. That said, let me remind everyone what will happen next. Our next talk will take place on February 29th, hosting Professors Deniz Aksoy and David Carter. and this talk will be moderated by Dr. İlker Kalın from our center. Both scholars will talk about the challenges associated with accessing local knowledge and data. So we will really enjoy if you spread the word for this talk as well. Once again, thank you very much, Kathleen, for your contributions, and hope to see you soon, maybe in ISA.
Thanks. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks everybody for participating. Thank you, Efe.
Bye.